Okay, so let's talk about Express. Let me actually go back to the beginning here. Okay, so Express, as you've seen, is a module that will allow you to build web applications. Okay, so one of the things that we think about with web applications is really when you end up seeing how requests end up going back and forth to the server, this is an agreed upon protocol. So HTTP is an agreed upon protocol. That's why you end up seeing with your request, you see headers going in a certain format, you see the responses in a certain format, you see the status codes in certain formats. It's an agreed upon protocol. Our browser makes a request with an agreed upon protocol. Our server ends up handling it. So Express, right, is basically using HTTP. And again, you could sort of think about it as an etiquette. It's a language that we end up using. So, our request ends up going across, goes to the server, and a response ends up getting sent back. It's important that every request has exactly one response. Now, you could say, well, didn't you have a page there and you also had your CSS file? That's true, okay? But we had a request for our main page. That ended up coming back. The main page had a link for a style sheet which made another request, okay? But it's exactly one request, one response. So there are rules. These are implementations. It's used for communication. And Node's HTTP library is an implementation of this. And Express is basically sitting on top of this. So you actually saw some of this already. When we ended up doing a request, the body ended up coming across by default in these URL encoded format. Okay? Basically, the form had a format, and it ends up going up to the server, and we said we had a form, and we posted it, and the browser, by default, sends it that way. There are ways of modifying that as well. So if we think about this, a couple of things here. We've got the URI of where we're going to. We've got our verb. We've got some headers that go there, and we've got a body. We don't always have a body. We have a body when we end up doing a post or a put. Gets and deletes don't get any bodies. They would end up getting ignored. We have responses. Responses have different status codes. We've seen two. We've seen a 200 status code. Okay? We've also seen a 302 status code, which is a redirect. The browser, again, based on communication, there's an etiquette. Browser says, okay, you send me a 302, this means I should go somewhere else. And that's how the browsers ended up implementing them. If the browsers didn't implement them based upon the protocol that everybody wanted to use, you'd end up getting another browser. Okay? So here's a sample of a response. This is our status code. These are our headers that come back, and this is our payload that comes back. So here are some status codes that we'll be taking a look at. We've got a 200 status code. There are some other ones that we'll end up looking at. There's some where we can't find the page. There are some where we might want to indicate a server error. There are some where we might want to tell the user, hey, look, you're unauthorized, you can't see this. But we're not going to get to that for a while. So Express is a library for handling this, and, well, the code demo you saw already. So Express is going to end up treating things as objects, and basically we're going to match on two things, right? A verb, a get, a post, okay, and also a route, /product/products ID, and it allows us to do a pipeline, a chaining of handlers. We could do an app.use that gets called by everything, okay, and then we could have a specific route that ends up getting called, and it allows us to have this layer of routes. Pop quiz, okay, client is something that makes HTTP requests. Server would be what? Handles the request and sends the response. Okay? A request is going to be a formatted message, right? That's going to have a couple of different things: a verb, a URL, URI, route, headers, and not body all the time. A GET request doesn't have a body, but some requests like post and put and patch do. Response is a reply, contains payload. Possibly, not always. When we ended up doing our 302, that didn't have any sort of payload. That was empty. So request, response cycle, client initiates the request. There's always one response. So Express is a middleware, right? We can see that it always has the form request, response, next. So if we end up passing this query string, we could pass data from the client to the server. Here we could actually pass it two different ways. We could end up passing it on the query string. We didn't do this. We ended up using our params, but if we ended up looking at our request object, there's a query object, and we'd be able to say request.query.x, request.query.foo, but these URLs look kind of ugly, so I try to avoid them and try to do things like ID and that sort of thing, although you might see it this way as well. But what I was getting at before is that if you did a console.log, in this case to request.query, you would see that this string, request, would be converted to an object. Express is doing that for us. Another way that we can end up passing data is with the body, and you've seen we could use a body, but let's be clear about that. We can't use a body right off the bat. We have to use our body parser. So an install, a couple of lines of code. Every Express app is going to use it. So request params, this could give us a variable portion of the URI. We have this idea of a router, right? So a router is going to be basically a layer of middleware, right? So in our case, where we created a router for products, basically allows us to separate a collection of routes, okay? Anything coming in with /products, go over here to this router. Use this router. What does it allow us to do? Make our code modular. If I go look into your server.js file, and I see /products, /products/ID, app.post/products, okay? I'm going to look at it and say, why don't you pull this out, separate it out, get into the habit of doing that. Set up with a separate router. It's a couple of lines of code. You'll be happy that you did it. So some things to sort of look at. The routes are not file paths, right? If we want to use file paths, we end up doing that by using a static router, which again, the way to think about that is someone comes in with a specific path, we're mounting it to some folder, okay? We look after that path, if that file exists within that folder, that static middleware will return it, and we're done. No next is called, our response is done. By the way, behind the scenes, what it's probably doing, request, response.send file. Internally, if you look at the Express static middleware, that's probably what it's doing. A couple of things, we've spoken about this request params versus request query. Request params are named params. Request.query would be if you had a question mark. Request.body would be when you were doing a post and you wanted to look at that data that you ended up getting post. I don't use app.all, so I'm not exactly sure what that is. App.use, we ended up using a couple of different ways when we wanted to set up our static middleware, or we want to basically do something for a specific path. And that does it for those slides.